Hey guys, so President Yoon has officially been removed from office. The Constitutional Court has confirmed the impeachment motion that the National Assembly made back in December after President Yoon went ballistic and declared martial law to supposedly resolve an issue over the budget. He wasn't getting along with the opposition party. It was a very tense situation because they're also going after his wife. And up until then, he's just been like, veto, veto, veto. You trying to, create a bill to investigate my wife? Veto. But the opposition was finding these different ways to propose a bill, pass a bill, which they actually did a couple months ago, to investigate the wife that couldn't be vetoed. However, on the surface, it was more like they couldn't agree about the budget, and so he had to declare martial law. And I thought about it, I was like, wow, the biggest Karen in the world is actually a middle-aged South Korean man who has a hankering for mint chocolate ice cream. He didn't just asked to speak to the manager of the National Assembly. He just didn't even call the police. He called in the nation's military and violated the Constitution, and to try to arrest everybody that was against him.
There's a Karen here, there's a Karen there are Karens everywhere. Let's see how they're faring on Good Karen.
South Korea's president has a 5-year term. He barely finished 3 years. And one of the lawmakers from the opposition party said, the enemy of democracy must be defeated by democracy. So now that President Yoon is out of office, there will be a new presidential election within 60 days, most likely beginning of June, where there'll be a snap election for a brand new president. And because he got impeached, President Yoon, he can't have his personal driver, because apparently if you're retired president, you get a personal driver, 3 assistants, and a pension of about 15 million won per month, or about 95% of your salary. So that comes out with this horrible exchange rate right now, about $10,000 a month. He doesn't get any of that, and he now, just in general, when you're no longer the president, he doesn't have the legal immunity against prosecution. So now the criminal suits and prosecution is going to start. Before, with this whole impeachment, it was just about whether he gets removed from office or whether he gets to stay in office. If he got to stay in office, then all them other, criminality stuff would have to wait until he's out of office. And, that's a lot of the reason why when you have the next president come in, then they go after the previous president, because only then can you hold them accountable for stuff that you think was, criminal. And then, it's just an unfortunate way of the system. It's meant to just protect the leadership while they're in office, so that unless it's extremely egregious like this was, you don't really remove presidents. You don't really get them on the criminal stuff, because you have to have a stable leadership. That's the theory anyway. And in a very extreme situation, you remove them, and then, it follows with the criminal prosecution right afterwards. And if we go back to this early December 3rd, this was extremely extreme and sus. Remember, 10/27 is when he declared the martial law, like when most people were going to sleep. So when you think about this, it's actually quite creepy, because they had lined up the situation where they would go and arrest people, out of their bed, essentially, and haul them off. President Yoon had prepared a little bunker cell to arrest these people, including journalists, and that would be in the middle of the night when you feel like, oh, we can get away with it. You know, it's cold outside. You know, people probably just, you know, still Christmas shopping online. And no, the National Assembly members just hightailed it to the National Assembly, and by 1 a.m. they voted to end the martial law. And then it took a while for President Yoon to come around to it, and then by dawn he had said, oh yeah, oopsies, yeah, we're just going to cancel this, and I didn't really mean for it to be that serious, so you know, we're all good, right? Well, no. Everyone's mad. That was extreme. So then December 7th, lawmakers made their first impeachment motion, but it didn't pass because President Yoon's party didn't want to impeach him, and they boycotted the session because, you know, if you have an impeached president, you're essentially going to lose your job in the next election because you're associated with an impeached president. Well, a week later, December 14th, the impeachment motion did pass because 12 members of Yoon's party had joined the opposition vote, and then that started the whole review by the court. And then on Friday, Korea time, we got the final verdict. He is impeached, and he has been immediately removed from office. There are 8 justices right now on the Constitutional Court. There's supposed to be 9, but for a while it was stuck at 6, and essentially President Yoon was also being accused of like just kind of keeping it at 6 because then they can't really do anything. And so they added 2 more members during this interim, and then so now we had 8 justices. They voted unanimously. All of them said that, you know, Yoon, you gotta get out of here. And there were 5 main points for impeachment put forward by the National Assembly. So remember, the National Assembly, the Congress of Korea, has to be the entity in the government that first says, okay, we are going to impeach the president, and then it has to be approved by the judicial branch, the Constitutional Court. And so the main thrust of the ruling was that the president's martial law declaration was a betrayal of public trust and severely endangered the stability of the democratic republic. And so again, this took a long time, 111 days. President Roh Moo-hyun's impeachment case was 14 days, and he wasn't impeached. And then President Park Geun-hye took 11 days, and she was impeached. And so the 5 key action areas were declaring martial law, writing up a martial law decree, deploying troops to the National Assembly, raiding the National Election Commission, and attempting to arrest politicians. Yeah, all of this is quite serious stuff. It's not just kind of like, oh, oopsie daisy, you know, I just meant to just kind of halfway do it and just send a message out there because we weren't getting along with passing a budget. So under the Constitution, though, when can you declare martial law? It's only like if there's a war or if there's an equivalent national emergency to war, not just a war of the budget not passing, or the war of the heart to protect his wife from investigation. It has to only be for serious things. Also, the court had to decide whether Yoon violated to the law to a serious enough extent that would warrant his dismissal. So for an impeachment case for the Constitutional Court, it's not just like, ooh, once you pass this line, you're out. It's like you've passed this line and whether it was significant. And I think that is the litmus test that President Yoon was trying to stake his legal argument on by saying like, oops daisy, I didn't really mean to do it. I was going to reverse it. It wasn't fully, done all the way. So I think he was trying to slip through that loophole of whether it was a serious enough violation. And the court did not buy his defense over there. So it looks like now that we're going to most likely have opposition party candidate to win the presidential election, the snap election in June. And of course, yes, the front runner at 34% is Jae-myung, the very problematic candidate, even within his own party, very problematic. You can see all my other videos about him. I still stand by the same opinion I had years ago about him as I do now. However, the martial law thing was just way too much of a blunder and way too much of, like, you calling in the SWAT team because you want your neighbor to turn down their music. It was just way out of bounds, and I know a lot of Korea agreed with that, and so did the Constitutional Court. And so now we're going to see more of a criminal trial on charges of inciting an insurrection through the martial law. And that can be maximum penalty of life in prison or death for President Yoon, or former President Yoon. President Yoon is not detained anymore. He was detained in January, but he was released in early March, so it looks like he'll be able to, continue to go through all of his prosecutorial situations from the comfort of his own home. But the own home is now, he has to move out of the presidential house and then most likely move back to his apartment in Seocheodong, which is like right across the street from the courthouse. I don't think he'd be going to that court. Maybe he will be. So maybe he'll be able to walk to his trials and all that. So now let's take a closer look at the actual reading of the ruling, and it was read by the Chief Justice Moon Hyung-bae. And first, they're being very formal about this. First of all, they had to answer the question like whether they can actually have the right to rule on this impeachment, whether this is subject to judicial review, whether it qualifies to be on the level of a constitutional matter. And they said that even though this martial law declaration had a high degree of political determination, they needed to review it because the impeachment procedure was valid. The National Assembly voted on the impeachment, and it could not be deemed unlawful because there was no parliamentary judicial committee or legislation. So Yoon's camp was saying like, well, this process wasn't done correctly. Like, you forgot a signature on the filing or something. You got to send it back. They were saying that, no, you don't have to do a committee, when after you vote for the impeachment, and then you have the option for a committee within the National Assembly, two of them, legislative, judiciary, to then, investigate and hash out more information. But the National Assembly can be like, no, pass, let's just give it directly to the Supreme Court, and that's what they did. So the request for impeachment trial is legal, says the Constitutional Court ruling. Now they are talking about whether this violation of the law is serious enough to lead to dismissal from the presidential office. And they also wanted to clarify that this impeachment motion was not seen as an attempt by the Liberal Party to just, impeach to try to get President Yoon out of there and abuse their legislative power in order to put their person, most likely Lee Jae-myung, into the office of the presidency. And the Constitutional Court said like, no, that's just, President Yoon was the one that did the martial law. If he had not done the martial law and then they tried to impeach him, then it looks very shady on the opposition party's part. But President Yoon was the one that went through with martial law. Now, if you're doing like 5D, 6D Korean chess in politics, then, did the liberal camp plant somebody in President Yoon's inner circle and whisper in his ear, somehow convince him that martial law would be a good idea? I mean, that would be total subterfuge.
제가 하는 모든 일은 우리의 삶, 우리 서민들의 삶과 이재명의 참혹한 삶이 투영되어 있습니다. 앞으로도 여러분을 위해서, 세상을 위해서 최선을 다하겠습니다. 여러분 고맙습니다.
But at least the way it looks on the surface, President Yoon was the one that decided to do martial law, so he set the impeachment ball rolling in motion himself. Now, the Constitutional Court saying like, okay, this whole thing about the budget, you know, y'all arguing about next year's Chuck E. Cheese money could not have been a factor in declaring martial law because the 2025 budget plan could not have influenced the 2024 budget plan at the time that martial law was declared because there was no plenary session approval for it. So it's like it wasn't even on the table. So, you know, stop using that as an excuse, and especially stop using it as an excuse to justify the president using this emergency power of martial law. Also, they said that they can't see any existence of any serious reason for the suspicion of election fraud. The National Election Commission has been following very transparent measures for opening the ballot boxes and introducing a ballot counting process. Then they went on to say like, okay, really, but martial law, when you declare martial law, it requires a national emergency such as war. And the court said like, okay, President Yoon, you said that the grave crisis occurred because of the unilateral budget cuts and by the Liberal Party holding the majority in the National Assembly. You ask any president, prime minister around the world, this is like a daily thorn in your side, daily issue. It's not something, otherwise you're going to be having like martial law popping up everywhere. Now, President Yoon did complain and said that, look, the liberal camp has been using a lot of impeachment to launch political attacks. 22 impeachment motions had been submitted against people in his cabinet to get rid of them. And so from the liberal camp side, they're saying that like, look, you appointed all of these people who have no idea what they're doing and they're messing up, so we got to impeach them. President Yoon's side is more saying like they're just preemptively impeaching. They didn't really do anything wrong. But the court is saying that, no, you can't use this impeachment motion argument because, yes, there was a lot of impeachment motions, but the only impeachment motions under review that were in progress was against the prosecutor and the Korea Communications Commission chair. So it's just 2 impeachment motions. So that cannot be like a grave crisis to justify martial law. Again, they said like, look, this has to be based on real substantive stuff, including a military necessity or a threat to public safety. And all your squabbling should have just been handled through the political process or judicial process. You don't involve the military, you know, you don't call, this is like, I'm saying, the Uber Karen. I'm calling my military troops and the National Intelligence Service. Let's see, how about that? Also, the court said that we can't accept President Yoon's argument that this was just a warning and that when you really look at it, he didn't stop at the declaration of martial law. He mobilized the military and police. If it was just a warning, he would just say like, I'm gonna declare martial law, y'all, but then hold back on, you know, sending out people to arrest politicians and to send out the police to block access to the National Assembly so the democratic process would be frozen. No. And where was the cancellation order? Or where is this thing that, you know, where it was just like, okay, it's going to expire at the stroke of midnight on the next day because it was supposed to just be a warning. It was open-ended. Oh, if people didn't have insomnia these days and then immediately go out to the streets to stop this mess and everybody, you know, took their little melatonin and fell asleep that night, that would have been a completely different Korea when they woke up. And the judge specifically started citing the receipts. He said, President Yoon asked the Minister of National Defense to deploy the military to the National Assembly, and he told the Army Special Warfare Commander to break down the door and drag the lawmakers out. They didn't like that. Also, the police chief blocked access to the National Assembly, and some of the members of the National Assembly who were gathering at the Assembly building were unable to enter, and they had to climb over a fence. We saw all of that live on camera. And this is the scary part. The Minister of National Defense ordered that the commander of the Counterintelligence Command confirm the locations. Like, yeah, we know where 14 people are. 14 people, including the National Assembly Speaker, representatives of each political party, for the purpose of arresting them if necessary. What was this? Like, they got some GPS tracker, like through your phone or something, or satellites. They're gonna be able to know, oh, we know where these 14 people are. If we want to go arrest them, we can, pop them into a van. So in essence, President Yoon violated the National Assembly members' rights to deliberate and vote and their privilege of immunity from arrest. So this immunity from arrest for the lawmakers, this is exactly the scenario where that comes into play. Usually we talk about the lawmakers, geez, they're getting away with so much stuff because they have this immunity from arrest while they're a lawmaker. So a lot of stuff is sliding, and that seems really horrible. But then, in the back of your mind, you should always remember that it's designed for cases like this so that the president can't just go take the police and say, you're arrested to all the lawmakers, and say that, like, okay, once you're arrested, you got to be, you can't be a lawmaker anymore. And therefore, then he becomes a dictator because the National Assembly he is able to eliminate by just arresting everybody. And so that's why they have this immunity from arrest. All at the same time, during peaceful times, you should not be abusing it, although we see that a lot. So the big why this is horrible, the Chief Justice said Yoon violated the political neutrality of the military. The military is not supposed to be just the lapdog of a particular president or a particular political party. They have to be neutral to defend the country as a whole. President Yoon violated the duty of the military commander, interfered with local council and political party activities regarding the proclamation, violated the principle of separation of powers, violated constitutional martial law and the warrant system to restrict basic rights, violated the freedom of occupation of the people. Not only that, he mobilized military forces to directly be in confrontation with ordinary citizens. Remember, we saw those videos of the grandmas laying down on the street so that the military vehicles wouldn't, go another inch. People openly fighting with police and military officers that were deployed to block the National Assembly. And I think this is the thing that was the nail in the coffin, because them judges also do not like it when you go after their crew personally. Once you make it personal, you're going to lose. So the Chief Justice said that regarding the tracking of the members of the judiciary's locations, it was carried out with the intent to arrest them if necessary, and even a former Chief Supreme Court Justice was included on the list. Former Chief. So basically, that's their Sunbae. There's oh, you mess with our Sunbae. Out. Impeached. So in essence, now they're getting, broader and broader with the why. They said that, quite simply, President Yoon's actions violated the basic principles of a democratic state, undermined constitutional order, and caused serious harm to the democratic republic. So essentially undermining the foundational part of democracy as a whole. He really did not know the gravity, I think, of what he was doing. And there again, the problem with a little bit with the prosecutors becoming the president The president has to operate within a whole checks and balances system, but a prosecutor can be just very narrow and just go after win. I just need a win. And he was thinking, I think, like a prosecutor and using whatever tools he had, and he had the entire arsenal that he could force to, obviously, to some extent, although it looked like there was still some resistance, but that resistance, it didn't work, obviously, because he went and did his martial law, and they followed along with him. And this was very wise, or a little Confucius-ish, of the Chief Justice. He said that even if the conduct of the National Assembly is perceived as tyranny of the majority, the president is obligated to ensure that there are checks and balances among the branches of government. So essentially he's saying, like, the president has to be a bigger man about this, or woman, that if this really is sort of unfair, you have to resolve that unfairness by making it more fair, like making sure that the institutions and how you solve it is going to be more fair. You don't react to tyranny with dictatorship. Although that is the natural inclination, right? When you're fighting or you're just going to try to win at all costs, like who can wait to be fair and lose? I mean, that's like fighting over the last Hanu steak at E-Mart, but when you are the president of South Korea, you don't act that way. You don't respond to tyranny of the majority and relentless political attacks against you by then throwing off democracy and then just putting on the code of a dictator. We don't do that anymore. Yes, on the surface, President Yoon said that, this was about the budget and this tyranny from the Liberal Party attacking me. But really, again, at the end of the day, a lot of it was about his wife, protecting his wife. Because even after the National Assembly regained control after this martial law, the two bills that they were focusing on, like one, of course, was impeachment. And the other one was like, let's move forward with this investigation of his wife. So it was true that he was having a big attack on his wife, and still to this day, and it continued on. And yet the excuses he gave for martial law never mentioned his wife at all. But again, I will reiterate that I think because it doesn't make sense. This whole budget thing, it doesn't make sense even for him. But he has to say it in that way because that's the only digestible explanation. But what would move him so cuckoo would be he has to protect his wife, and I guess his wife is so important to him. And we've already heard all of the reports and even the interviews from her mouth herself saying that, like, she's kind of like the person that wears the pants in this relationship, and seems like she got a lot aggressive. The bodyguards for the president apparently got yelled at by President Yoon's wife for not preventing him getting taken in January to detention. And she said to them, "What's the point of you carrying a gun then?" So it kind of given that she might be the trigger happy mastermind behind martial law, just being like, let's just do martial law, like she Ava Perón or something. And saying like what? So she expected the bodyguards to shoot down other people to prevent them from legally taking and detaining your husband who illegally declared martial law? And so these were the accounts of the bodyguards that reported it. So unless the reports were fabricated, unless they're lying, and or if they're not lying and the reports were manipulated by the media that reported on it, like, that's pretty serious. And that's pretty crazy that she would be so bold and aggressive about that. And they even said that she said, like, oh, I want to shoot Jae-myung and myself. Obviously, she hates the man. Obviously, she hates all of the politicians going after her wanting to tear her down and, prosecute her for, some of the shady stuff that she might have done. And it's a political battle. So again, the Constitutional Court is saying, like, okay, fine, like, y'all have your political battle, but keep it in the political realm, or in the other part of the judiciary, in our department where we handle stuff like that, but not at this national level where we have to see like what you're doing, your little games against each other is essentially violating the Constitution and destroying the fabric of democracy in South Korea, which is, already some areas are a little patchy and threadbare. They got to, strengthen it up, not bore through the elbows. So this has been a crazy ride, but I'm glad that it seemed like it was very resolute. They took their time with it, and that they properly addressed all 5 areas of contention, and they made it very much like, okay, this is what we cover in the Constitutional Court. This is why it was correct for it to be here, and this is why we ruled unanimously to remove President Yoon, because this martial law business, that should not be on the list of potential solutions when President Karen has a problem. You don't declare martial law. All right, guys, what do you think? Put your comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.